Hello, everyone. It's 6 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. I do have a few housekeeping items before we start the webinar tonight, but thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Robin Hughes, and I'm the Sport and Coaching Coordinator at viaSport. Tonight's session is on identifying and avoiding conflicts of interest in sport-related decisions, with special guest Marie-Claude from the Sport Dispute Resolution Centre of Canada. We are looking to host these opportunities every month, and I will send out an email afterwards just to receive a quick feedback survey, and would love to hear suggestions on future topics that you would be interested in. Before we get started, the line sounds pretty good right now. But if you do have any background noise, I just ask that you mute your line. You can do that by pressing *1, and you can also unmute it pressing *1 as well if you would like to speak. Each of you who have supplied your NCCP number on your registration form will receive 2 NCCP PD credits for attending the webinar tonight. It will be on your locker transcript probably within about a week. If you have signed in only using your first name, I just ask that you send your full name in the chat box so I can make sure that you do receive the points if you'd like them. And just so everyone knows, this webinar is being recorded. It will be sent out afterwards in the wrap-up email as well. I'll send you the link so you can have that. And I will send out a copy of the presentation as well. As we go through the presentation, you can use the question chat box on the right-hand side. If you have questions for Marie-Claude along the way, she can address them. I just ask that due to the nature of this topic, please don't disclose any personal dispute questions. I'm sure Marie-Claude would be happy to follow up with you personally afterwards if you do have any questions for her that are very personal incidences. But looks like we have a full roster of 26 people on the call, so I will pass it over to Marie-Claude and we'll get started.
Thank you, Robin. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Excellent. I hope the sound is good. Not too loud, not too faint.
Sounds good for me.
Okay, good. Let me just try the, so do I have the presenter rights to be able to move the PowerPoint slides?
You do. It should just be your keyboard. The arrow.
Oh, so I have to physically click the arrow in the corner.
Yep.
There we go. Okay.
Perfect.
Excellent. Well, good evening, everyone. Just so you know, it's 9 o'clock here, so I hope sometimes when I speak at later hours like this, mostly to BC people, I look for my words. My first language is French, and the more tired my brain gets, the more I'm searching for my words in English. So I hope you apologize if I have some hesitations at certain moments. Today we'll talk about identifying and avoiding conflict of interest in sports-related decisions, and I'm sure that there's a lot of stuff happening in your head right now. You'll be spinning at some point thinking, oh my God, this is exactly what is happening in my organization. We need to find solutions to this. So there's no magic solutions. I'm going to give you some practical tips that you can implement in the way you manage your sport organization or your sport team, your sport clubs, associations, so that you reduce the chances that there are going to be conflicts of interest in the way you make decisions, and that and at the same time, you're reducing the possibility of people disputing decisions because they think that the people who made them were in conflict of interest. So just to get started quickly, we'll be, I guess, oh, sorry, I have the wrong arrow. Trying to go back. So I'll do a quick introduction of the SDRCC, just so that you have a sense of where we come from and why we're able to talk to you about conflict of interest. And then we're going to play a little game of myth and reality. So I'll present you with some statements, and I'll ask you to tell me whether you think it's a myth or a reality. And Robin will manage the answers for me. And then, of course, I'll give you the answers. Then we'll talk about a conflict of interest and what it is and what type of conflicts can arise, especially in small sport organizations. And then we'll talk about best practices, what to do to avoid them or what to do when they arise to properly handle the situation. And then we'll, if we have time, we'll talk about 2 SDRCC cases that involve people being accused of conflict of interest. And I'll explain to you what the arbitrator found in those 2 particular cases. And then we'll handle some questions. Of course, as Robin mentioned, if there are questions that are specific to what I'm talking about, and you think it's appropriate to ask it right away so you have a better understanding when we continue the presentation, feel free to type them in and ask them right away. If you think that your question can wait until the end, then you can jot it down on a piece of paper and then we can address it at the end. So I'm sure we'll have some time for that. All right. So, an overview of the Sports Dispute Resolution Center of Canada. I did not choose the acronym for this, by the way. The French one is just as complicated. But I've been there as a CEO for 10 years. On average, I'd say I've seen about 45 cases per year, which would make me an expert in dispute resolution in sports, having witnessed and followed closely 450 cases, maybe more. So back in 2000, the Minister of Sports was Denis Coderre, and he was receiving phone calls from parents and athletes of the national team and lots of people in the sports community complaining about the decision-making process in their federation, feeling that they were discriminated against or that due process was not followed. And he didn't think that it was the minister's job to receive these phone calls. So he struck a work group to evaluate what was going on in the sports system and try to make recommendations. And this work group, after consultation of the sports community, concluded, and they opened their report by saying, due to a lack of fair and consistent policies or to the improper administration of those policies, athletes and other participants in sport are being disciplined, harassed, or denied opportunities without a proper recourse to a hearing or appeal. Out of that report, there was a few recommendations. One of them was to establish an alternative dispute resolution system in Canada to deal with those sports disputes and avoid having to go in the court system where it's taking a long time, it's very costly for the parties, and most often the decisions are not practicable for the sports system. So they created the SDRCC as a not-for-profit organization. It's funded 100%, and I'd say 99.5% by Sport Canada. We do have some revenues on the side, but very little of it. We were established in 2004, so 4 years only after the report was published, there was a federal act passed in Parliament in Ottawa to create the SDRCC. Our role is to prevent and resolve disputes in the sports system, mostly at the national team level. And I'm sorry, I just noticed that the numbering of my bullet points there are really, really crooked. So I apologize for that. It's probably a copy-paste error. So we do have professional mediators and arbitrators on our roster. We've been recruiting. Actually, we have a new bunch coming in May. But these people are scattered around the country. They are professional arbitrators and mediators in other fields, so they are very, very experienced people in dealing with conflict. And then we train them specifically on the reality of the sports system so that when they come to the SDRCC cases, they understand what the underlying situations are. We also have arbitrators and mediators who have been athletes, who have been coaches, who have sat on boards of different sport organizations. So they're very much in touch with the sports community, which civil court judges don't have that advantage over our arbitrators and mediators. They don't always understand what's going on in the amateur sports system. So we offer services across Canada in both official languages. And we're also the designated doping tribunal in Canada. So if an athlete in Canada is accused of a doping violation, and that athlete has a right to a hearing before an arbitrator to determine whether or not they've actually breached the rules, and if so, what the proper sanction should be. So in that case, the SDRCC would be the tribunal handling the case. So just to give you a quick overview of case numbers, ordinary cases are orange. The trend line is on the way up, by the way, not necessarily a good sign. We try to do a lot of education and prevention, but there's also an increased awareness about the existence of the SDRCC among athletes, so they tend to defend their rights maybe a bit more than in the past. So last year we had a record year of 61 cases. We busted our budget. We'd had to ask for more money from Sport Canada. This year is closer to the annual average. We're right now at 46, I think, or 45 maybe. So it's an average year for us. The type of disputes that we do, apart from doping, which constitutes about 42% of our cases, are team selection disputes, carding disputes, disciplinary issues, eligibility. So those, and then we have a few also governance issues and a lot of others, miscellaneous, I'd call them. But that gives you a picture of what we do. I want to talk a little bit about dispute resolution and what we offer at the SDRCC. So on the right-hand side, we've seen their trial. The trial is when you go to civil court, you go to the Court of Appeals, you go to the Supreme Court of Canada. It's it's a rigid process, and most of the time you have to have lawyers coming with you. Very expensive as well. The administrative hearing would be a process that's less formal, and a good comparison of that would be the small claims court, where you don't necessarily have to have a lawyer, but there's a fairly strict process that's being followed during the proceedings. Arbitration is is more flexible in terms of process. It's also a process by which the parties decide on how the arbitration will be conducted, how quickly we need a decision, and they can invite affected parties to. So it's very much it's a process that's owned by the parties. The mediation or resolution facilitation is also a process that is owned by the parties, but what's different from arbitration is that they own the solution as well. So in mediation and resolution facilitation, the parties decide on the outcome. So they come to an agreement with the help of the mediator to a solution that's going to be easily implementable, that's going to satisfy the interests of all the parties around the table. And then they move on in a positive manner. If you go to arbitration, you have a decision by an arbitrator, so you're going to have a loser and a winner. Most of the time, at least one party will not be happy with the outcome. Somewhere in the middle, we also have what we call med-arb, and it's a hybrid process whereby we try with the parties, we try to settle the issue with the help of a mediator. And if the parties cannot find a solution on their own with the help of the mediator, then the mediator becomes an arbitrator and will render a final and binding decision on them. Then I'm going back to the orange. So the orange titles are things that the SDRCC does, and the green ones are not offered. And really, negotiation is a really good way to resolve a dispute. But we often forget it because when we're in a dispute with someone, emotions really run high. We're not really tempted to sit down and talk about it. But what we don't realize is in our day-to-day life, we do negotiate a lot. We negotiate with our kids. We negotiate with our spouse. We negotiate with our coworkers. So negotiation is when a dispute arises, but negotiation is really good also to avoid a dispute. But negotiation is done without the help of a third party. And then the next one is prevention. And this is part of what I'm doing tonight, is to educate the sports community about ways to handle their business and their sport organizations and decision-making in their sport organizations so that they reduce the chance that they're going to need to negotiate, mediate, arbitrate, or even go to court. All right, so as you move from left to right on that spectrum, the cost will escalate. It will take longer to resolve. There's going to be more formality, more complexity, a greater involvement of third parties, so you have less control over the outcome, and there's a greater potential for damaging relationship. And that's a really important one in sport, which may not be the case outside of sport. If you have a disagreement with your supplier because he delivered something that was not on time, or he delivered something that not what you ordered, well, next time around, whether or not you settle with them or you win arbitration, you can turn around and deal with another supplier later on. But when you're in a sports system and if you're a small sport organization, if you don't solve a dispute in a way that manages the relationship and builds the relationship or preserves it, then you're losing players in your sports system, and you're losing athletes that you've invested time in. You're losing volunteers. You're losing coaches because they get fed up with all the disputes and the problems in the sport organization, and they leave the sport or they go and play another sport, which is not good for you. And then also, as you move from left to right, there's a greater focus on who's right and who's wrong. And even if you have a decision from a judge, it doesn't necessarily resolve the issue and the reasons why this issue cropped up. Whereas when you do prevention, negotiation, mediation, you find practical solutions to resolve the dispute, but also implement strategies in the future to make sure it doesn't happen again. The judge won't allow you to do that because they don't tell you how to organize your things better. So the education objective at the SDRCC is to develop new content and tools to further inform and educate members of the Canadian sports community about dispute resolution and effective risk reduction strategies. So we have a kiosk. We go at conferences and events. We do presentations and workshops and webinars by invitation. And we also do some consultation on policy drafting. So if you're in the process of drafting, for example, team selection policy for the Canada Games, and you're not sure, you'd like to have some expert advice on building your policy, you could contact us. We'll take a quick look. We'll give you some feedback. We're not going to write the policy for you. We don't give legal advice. But one of the things we can do is we can point out where you can improve your policy. We can point out where there's loopholes or cracks that situations can fall through that are going to cause dispute. So that's an opportunity for you to consult us on that. Some of the sample topics that we cover at our workshops and presentations: rights and responsibilities for athletes, the causes of disputes and risk reduction strategies, team selection policies for those who are coaches. You might be interested in that. And we also talk about disciplinary process, which is also something that might interest administrators just as much as coaches, how to conduct internal appeals, etc. Quickly, I'm just going to show you this very, very quickly. If you go on our website in the publications section, you'll have a lot of documents that are on different themes that are might be of interest to you. I strongly suggest that you go visit our website, you decide what's relevant to you, and you can download copies. There's no copyrights on them. If you think that some of these documents are, I'm going too quickly here. So if you think that some of those documents are of interest to you and you'd like to have some copies to distribute to your board members or colleagues, then you can contact us and we'll send you some hard copies. So one of the documents that we have is main causes of disputes and prevention strategies, and we have actually identified 5 main causes of disputes over the 10 years that we've conducted dispute resolution for the sports system. And one of them is actually I don't know how this happened, but the red circle is supposed to be in the dark green. Someone must have flipped that picture on me. So one of the 5 most common disputes causes of disputes is that the decision maker is in conflict of interest. So this is what we're trying to do here, is prevent decision makers to be in conflict of interest. So apologize for the quirks in my presentation. So here you have a brochure. It's called Conflict of Interest in Sports-Related Decision Making. So a lot of the content I'm presenting tonight, you will find some interesting notes in that brochure. It actually unfolds as a poster with a flow chart of assessing whether or not someone is a conflict of interest and what should be the process taken to alleviate the situation or deal with it. So that, again, is available on our website in a PDF format, and you're welcome to order some print copies if you think they may be useful. So we're going to talk about what is a conflict of interest. It's just a definition here that's easy to understand. A situation whereby an individual has a private or personal interest sufficient enough to appear to influence the objectivity of his or her function as a decision maker. So really, if you have an interest in the decision you're about to make, going in one or another direction, you're being influenced by factors that have nothing to do with the decision you're supposed to make. And you're in the risk of making a decision that's going to be favorable to you, favorable to your interest, rather than what the right decision should be. So there are different types of conflict of interest, and we're going to go one by one. So there's a real, there's a potential, and there's a perceived. And I'll explain to you what the difference is between the three of them. So in a real conflict of interest, the decision maker does have a significant interest in the outcome of the decision. I'll give you an example of that. There's a lady on your team selection committee for the Canada Games, and her daughter is trying out to be named to the team. That mother is in conflict of interest. It's a real conflict. She does have a significant interest in the outcome of that decision, which, well, I guess in most cases would be that her daughter be on the team, unless she doesn't want her daughter to be on the team. That would be very surprising. But the decision maker in this case is in a real conflict of interest. We'll talk later about what should happen if it occurs in a sport organization that someone is in a real conflict of interest, what should take place to handle the situation. So when we're talking about a potential conflict of interest, is when the decision maker could have a personal interest in the outcome, but it's conditional to certain facts or circumstances occurring. So this is what's nice about the potential conflict of interest, is that you can see that coming, and you can already think about, oh, if those circumstances arise, then we need a plan B, because that person won't be able to maintain status as a decision maker. So let's go back to that example where you have the mother on the team selection committee or the high performance committee that's going to be deciding on who's going to go to the Canada Games on the next cycle. And her daughter is a really good athlete in the province, but all athletes, in order to be considered to be on the team, they have to meet a certain minimum eligibility criteria, which are very, very objective. So it's a minimum ranking points. Or so how you anticipate their potential conflict of interest is that if that daughter actually meets those eligibility criteria, then she becomes a candidate for the Canada Games team. And then, of course, if that's the case, that she meets those minimum eligibility criteria, then the mother is in conflict of interest. But in the course of the few months before that decision needs to be made, let's say the daughter does not meet the eligibility criteria, so she's ruled out, she's not even making the pool of athletes being considered, then the mother is not in conflict of interest anymore. So the potential allows you to foresee some circumstances that might require action to alleviate or eliminate the conflict of interest. So it's just it's a situation that you need to recognize ahead of time if you want to make it easier on yourself to deal with them. So the perceived conflict of interest, it's the one I like to call the smell test. And if you're on the outside and you're aware of certain things that happened and it doesn't smell good, then it may be just a perceived conflict of interest. What you need to do is investigate the facts and find out whether or not there was a real conflict of interest in that particular situation. So I'll give you an example of that. We have a young man who sits on the board of a figure skating club, and you find out through some members on the club that his mother was awarded the contract to make the uniforms this year. And it's a contract that pays, so it's not volunteer. She's going to get paid to make the uniforms for the club. So on the outside, you're like, oh yeah, of course, he must have decided that he was going to award the contract to his mother. But then you investigate, you search, you ask questions, you verify what really happened, and you may find out in searching that what happened is when they decided to search for a contractor to make the uniforms, they created a bid process that this young man being on the board was excluded from the discussions when they created the bid process and the bid conditions. And then the bid was published, so there was several companies that were able to apply for that contract. And when there was a board meeting to evaluate the different submissions or bids that the club received, that young man was not present at the meeting. So he actually stepped out of the meeting when that discussion was taking place, and he then returned to the boardroom once that decision was made. So in fact, he never had any influence. He didn't even know, by virtue of not having been part of the process at all and not even in a room when they discussed. So if his mother's bid had been a bad bid or not the best bid, he wouldn't have known what they had to say about it. So people would not have been influenced by his presence during the discussion. So the perceived one, you have to be careful not to jump to conclusions too quickly. Sometimes it does look fishy from the outside, but you have to know the facts before you make an adjustment or before you point a finger. And maybe your investigation will show that there was no conflict of interest. But the perceived one is actually one that's going to cause disputes because people will jump to conclusions quickly. They will point fingers and they will accuse without necessarily knowing what happened. So actually one of the cases maybe later we'll talk about will have some of those elements in there. So there's a myth or reality. And so we're starting with the first one. And thank you. I see that you have an opportunity to vote already, so I'll let you know what the question is. And then you can vote whether you think the statement is a myth or a reality. And when we're done with the voting, we'll let you know what the real answer is. So people are in conflict of interest. People in conflict of interest are great people. So is that a myth or reality? So I heard Robin say there's about 20-some people online, so I see there's still people voting. Give me a sign when the polling is completed. All right, I haven't seen a vote in a while, so perfect. So you're right, actually. You're right. It's a reality. And why people in conflict of interest are often the best people, and why? Because they end up being on multiple committees. They wear several hats because they're good. People want them on their committees. They want to recruit them. So there'll be coaches. There'll be officials. They'll sit on committees. and they'll sit on your board, and because they're great people. So you want them, they're invested, they're committed. The problem is the more you wear hats, the more you have to be attuned to what a conflict of interest is, and you have to recognize when they occur. So, but there was a small percentage of people who said it's a myth. I have to say there's also a very small percentage of people who will knowingly and voluntarily put themselves in conflict of interest. They want to manipulate the outcome. But I'd say it's a very, very small number of people. And maybe we'll talk about them later, but right now, yes, there are some people who are not in conflict of interest, and they're not necessarily great people, but I would say most of them are. So the next statement is, declaring conflict of interest is an admission of guilt. Okay, we'll get more participants this time around. So yes, actually, you're right again. Maybe you don't need to follow that workshop, but it is a myth, and that is, of course, you need to understand when you're declaring, you're not necessarily declaring a conflict of interest. You're declaring facts or circumstances that create a conflict, and by virtue of declaring it, you're actually expressing that you want to do things right. And if you want to do things right, you'll step out of the situation. But there's different ways to handle that. I don't want to give you all the answers right away, but there's different ways that you can handle the facts or circumstances. But absolutely important to declare those facts or circumstances. Do you think people may perceive the process to be to not make the smell test because you have not declared certain things that maybe you should have. All right, we'll go to the next one, which is pointing out a possible conflict of interest as an accusation. So is that a myth or a reality? All right, so I guess we're down to 19 people now, or at least 19 voting. So yes, and you're right again, and I don't know if you read the brochure before you came to the session, but it is a myth. Pointing out a possible conflict of interest is not an accusation. In fact, it should be part of a normal procedure, and if people know what a conflict of interest, they'll be able to identify them quickly. And sometimes it's better when it's noticed by the person in conflict and say, oh, maybe I shouldn't be here. But sometimes the people in conflict of interest, they don't even realize that they're a conflict of interest until someone points it out. So there's a way of pointing out a conflict of interest without sounding like an accusation. So that's one certainly thing that you can think of is if we do have to tell someone maybe it's not appropriate for you to continue in their decision-making capacity given certain circumstances, rather than saying you're a conflict of interest, you shouldn't be here. All right, the next myth or reality is that a conflict of interest is not only financial. Wow, you guys are good, and girls. So yes, a conflict of interest is not only financial, and actually if you listened earlier in the presentation, you would have seen from the definition that it's any interest, financial or personal. So it can be friendship, love, envy, ambition, family, or any personal or professional interest, and not always, and it could be not financial, but it could be professional in other sense. in terms of getting a promotion from someone if you in exchange for favors. So there we go. We're going to move to the next one, which is I can still remain objective, which we hear often. Is that a myth or reality? All right, with 21 answers now. All right, so, this one is closer to a split. And I have to say it is a myth. And I'm sorry for those who said reality. What happens if you are in conflict of interest is if you are convinced that you can still remain objective, you may actually cause harm to the person that you care about. And I'm giving the example of the father, and not father, mother, parent, who coaches their own kid. And sometimes in order to demonstrate that they're not serving any favors to their kids, they will be harsher on them. They'll be harder. They'll maybe yell at them or push them a little harder than the other kids on the team. And that actually is unfair. It's unfair to that athlete that because their parents, one of his or her parents happens to be the coach, that they're getting a harder, they're getting it harder essentially, and there's more pressure put on them to perform and so on. So if you are convinced that you can remain objective, I would suggest that you rethink this. If you do have an interest in the outcome of the decision, you are not able to remain objective. And again, as my example, you're concerned about not appearing biased may cause more harm to people you care about. So if you are in conflict of interest, you should automatically remove from the decision-making process. Is that a myth or reality? Okay, so I will surprise a lot of people apparently by saying that it is a myth. And the reason is in the sports system, and especially at the level where you operate at the moment, in a small sport organization, it's really, really hard to have completely independent people all the time, because you're dealing with neighbors and friends and family members and business associates from the sport community, and it's almost impossible to find someone truly independent. So what we've come up with, this is levels of conflict of interest, and there's some circumstances where you should absolutely remove yourself. It's not appropriate for you to continue. There are other circumstances where, as long as the parties are aware that you have certain facts or circumstances attached to an interest in a decision, then it may be possible for you to continue because those people may be convinced that you're still the best person who can make that decision based on your expertise or otherwise. So if people affected by the decision are consenting to you deciding because you're still the best person to make that decision, then it's okay to continue. And then we'll see some of those. So we have, I think it's the last one. It's all about honesty. Is that myth or reality? All right, we must be really close to the end of the poll now. So it is a myth, and the reality is that it's about knowledge. And some of you in the past might have been in conflict of interest and not disclose it and continue to act as a decision maker. And not necessarily because you're dishonest people, but simply because you didn't realize what a conflict of interest was and what to do if you end up in a conflict of interest. So I do strongly believe that good education is the starting point. Of course, when someone knows what a conflict of interest is and what needs to be done if they find themselves in a conflict of interest, then if they remain in that decision-making position, then it's all about honesty. Okay, but you start with the knowledge first.
Marie-Claude, there's a couple of comments in the chat box.
Yeah.
Kim was saying it also depends on the level of decision-making power on a committee. For arts juries, you can declare on perceived conflict of interest and still participate. And the rest of that decision-making body is then altered to the type of conflict, and a decision is made after.
Okay, let me, I'll read out, I can see them on the screen now. So. Yes, well, that's what I'm coming to. What I'm going to say that there are some circumstances where it's okay for you to continue, but these circumstances are very specific, so I was going to talk to that next. So I agree it depends on the decision-making power of the committee. It depends on also how many people on that committee, because if you're a single decision maker versus an entire committee, there's less of a chance that one person will make a difference. Yeah, and I see, Rob, yeah, knowledge and honesty are very different characteristics, and I agree with you. But what I'm saying is that it's not all about honesty. It is about knowledge first. And if you have someone who's knowledgeable but maintains a position of power while in conflict of interest, then it's a question of honesty. Or dishonesty, I would say. I think what the message here is that if you educate your members and people who are coaches and officials and administrators who sit on committees and make decisions, if you educate them about what is a conflict of interest and what they need to do when they find themselves in a conflict of interest, then you're going to reduce the chances that people are going to be sitting and making decisions while on conflict. And then they won't certainly appear to be dishonest because they will be more knowledgeable about it. So we'll talk about the best practices and what we need to do when we think that there's a conflict of interest happening. First of all, when I talked about the different levels of conflict of interest, in our brochure that I mentioned earlier, we identified 4 different levels of conflict of interest. So earlier I talked about the types. We have the real, the perceived, and the potential. Now I'm talking about levels, because sometimes it's not, there is a conflict, but maybe not enough to warrant you removing yourself from the process. And this model was borrowed from the guidelines on conflict of interest for arbitration of the International Arbitration Council, it's the IBA, for the International Bar Association. So we actually borrowed their model with their permission, where they had green, orange, and red, and flexible red. So in a green list, sorry, I'll call you again. Sorry, I hear some noise. I don't know if some people are actually starting to ask questions. Okay, maybe not. So in the green list, we include all the facts that are not considered objectively as conflict of interest but warrant caution. So what we're going to do in those situations, and I'll give you some examples, very, very often in small organizations it's really hard to find totally independent people, as I mentioned. So for example, if you've decided on an issue that involved the same people before, they must know that you've been involved in the decision making that affected the same people. And I don't say, you know, an official needs to disclose every time he makes a decision in a game and disclose that he's made a decision about the same parties again, but because it's all obvious and people know it. But if you've ever been in a decision-making capacity involving the same people, you have to be careful and at least disclose it. So it's not necessarily to disclose it, but it's preferable. If the people are aware, oh yeah, okay, you're the one who made that decision last time. Am I comfortable you continuing and dealing with this case? I'm a member of the same organization as one of or more of the parties. So if you're a provincial team coach and you sit on a selection committee for the provincial team, and there's an athlete from your club that is trying out for the team, you may want to disclose that when there's a discussion at the committee level so that everybody is aware and they make sure that you don't have an undue influence in putting your athlete on the team. Knowing the person who made the initial decision is also something that we've had, and I have a clear example of that. We have an arbitrator one day who was selected by the parties on the basis of his knowledge of a particular sport, because they thought, oh, he's knowledgeable of that sport, so we'll name it as an arbitrator. The problem that, you know, he came from a family who was heavily involved in that particular sport, and when he found out what the case was about, he realized that his brother had been the internal appeal adjudicator. So he was essentially asked to sit in and decide on an appeal that involved a decision made by his own brother. And he said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be, if I have to overturn my brother's decision, we're not going to have a very nice Christmas party. So if you know the person who made the initial decision, you should disclose it. And in that particular case, the arbitrator actually stepped out and said, I will not hear the case, but at the very least you need to disclose it. All right, so the orange list, then it becomes a little more tricky because you have a relationship with one of the parties. Situations that could create a perception of conflict of interest among the persons affected by decision. So mostly the people who are negatively affected by this decision will raise that as a concern. Having coached a party many years ago, so if you have coached someone a long time ago and you now have to make a decision about them that could be disfavorable to others and favorable to that person that you've coached, then that creates this perception.
Pretty hungry.
Sorry, I'm hearing people speak again. I don't know if there's a way, Robin, that you can mute people who are on the line, because I'm not sure if they're asking questions or not.
If you're on the line and you're not asking a question, I just ask that you mute it using *1 on your phone. That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. So what you need to do in situations of, and then I would also say orange list would be, an example of that would be that you voiced an opinion on a similar matter before. So if you voiced an opinion on a similar matter before, there's a perception on the part of others that you have set your opinion before even considering what decision you'll make. So you also have to be careful when you decide to voice your opinion on matters that you may be called to decide later on, because that may cause you to be in conflict of interest. So if you are in a situation of an orange list, and there's more of them, examples on the brochure that we talked about, you have to disclose, and if no one objects, you can continue to act as a decision maker. So at that point in the orange list, then it's the participants that may be affected by your decision that need to decide. So in a flexible red list, then you are getting a little more serious, and it's a serious conflict situation, but it's less serious than the inflexible. The inflexible, you have no choice but to step out and find someone else to make that decision. So in this case here, and I'll give you some examples. It's everything that's too close for comfort. essentially is the close ties with a family member of one of the persons involved in the decision, not involved in the decision, but that could be affected by your decision, or someone you're doing business with. So you have to disclose, and you have to require that all people who may be potentially affected by your decision to expressly agree to you continuing to act as decision maker. So it's got to be out in the open. You happen to be a close friend to the father of one of the athletes who may be affected by the decision. You need to put it all out, and people affected by your decision must know that you've declared this, and they must say, I am confident, despite the fact that he's close friends with that athlete, that this person is the best qualified to continue acting in a decision-making capacity. So the inflexible red list is these situations that raise the most serious concern about impartiality, and you have to refuse to act as a decision maker and just step out. So coaching, being the coach of one of the athletes involved, having a family member, being a family member of a person affected by the decision, having a financial interest in the decision, and the other one, which we find on a regular basis in sport organizations, unfortunately, is reviewing your own decision. So if your decision initially is being challenged by someone in an appeal process or in a review process, you cannot sit as a decision maker on a review process because you're reviewing your own decision, and that's an inflexible red list conflict of interest situation. So you can't be judge and party at the same time, essentially. All right, so I don't know if maybe I can pause and ask for if there's questions on what I've presented, because I'm going to start talking about some of the things that you can do to prevent these situations from occurring and creating conflict in your organization. Okay. Someone's typing. Oh, okay. No question then. We'll keep going. And of course, at the end, we'll have plenty of time to address questions. So thank you very much, Jill. So the model I showed you earlier had 5 main causes of disputes, and we also had 12 prevention strategies. I'm going to talk to you about a few of those prevention strategies that are directly linked with dealing with conflict of interest. So this one is an ounce of prevention, and that's the title of my slide. But really, what you want to have is a clear policy on conflict of interest. So that policy is going to ensure that you're providing a clear path for your members on how to deal with conflict of interest when they arise. So you train your new board members and your officials and your coaching teams about what is a conflict of interest, and here's what we established as a process to make sure that you're not in conflict of interest when you're making decisions on our behalf. The other one is to create an atmosphere where members feel comfortable declaring the situation. And there's different ways you can do that. I mean, the policy will give them guidance on what a conflict of interest is, when it's appropriate for them to declare, and what to do, and in what circumstances they should step out as decision makers. There's prevention measures that you can take as well. And I'll give you some examples of what we do at the SDRCC. And not necessarily when an arbitrator is doing a case, that's probably the most extreme one, but even our board members. Our board members are, some of them are linked to sport organizations in the sport community. And there's different ways that we can handle conflict of interest on our board. The first one is to declare facts and circumstances. We have a simple form that people every year need to declare to us their affiliations with support organizations or with companies, or if they're shareholders of a particular organization, that family members who are heavily involved in the sports system. So they need to declare those close ties. They have a kid who's on the national ski team, and we need to know that. So they will declare these facts. Once a year, we'll have them refill the form in case they have new circumstances to declare. They're not conflict of interest at that point. They're just facts and circumstances that just they turn on the yellow light, and we know, and we keep our radar on, and then we know that when there's a situation that arises, there's a let's say there's a, and we talked about the national ski team member, and we know his father is on our board. If there's a situation dealing with a case, and the board rarely hears about what's going on in the tribunal, but let's say there's a situation we need to bring to the board. We have a way now. We know that it's a ski team dispute, and we need to discuss it at the board level because something happens during the case, and we know this person is going to have to leave the room. And we don't need to wait until it's too late and we've already started talking about the case for him or her to say, oh, I'm sorry, I should probably not be part of the discussion because my son is on the team. So we lay it all out. The staff does it. The arbitrators and mediators do it, and our board members do it. And we even have it done also by our key suppliers, so IT people, the accounting suppliers, and so on. So we have them declare those conflicts, not those conflicts, those facts and circumstances may raise a conflict in the future. The other one is to add it to the meeting agenda, and our board does that very well, but it's part of the agenda. The template has the welcome from the chairperson and the adoption of the agenda. And once you've seen the agenda, you know if there's something, an agenda item that will be discussing something you shouldn't be part of. And that's an opportunity to say, well, that particular agenda item, I should not be present when you discuss it because it concerns X, Y, Z, and that would be a conflict of interest for me to be there for that discussion. So it makes it really, really easy for people to bring it up because it's part of the normal process. So we find it very helpful, and I say since we've done this, and we started that about 5 years ago, and it makes it really, really easy for people to say, hold on, I'm not sure I should be here. And then nobody feels bad about doing this because it's part of the process. Kim, I saw your question there, and yes, there is a link, and I think that it is Robin's intention to send you a link to the brochure that I've referred to.
Yes, absolutely. I'll send that out in the recap email.
Okay. All right, so the second one is to reduce the perception. So we want to have control mechanisms and approval that involves several individuals, and there was a reference to that in some of the comments earlier. And yes, if you're making really important decisions, it's good to have the approval of a higher authority. So it could be the coach, the head coach of the club or of the team. It could be a technical director that makes a decision, or that evaluates, that makes a recommendation to a higher authority. And it could be approved by the high performance committee. It could be approved by the board of directors. And what happens is the more individual you have involved in deciding, the less likely you'll have people pointing fingers and say, oh, of course, the head coach did not pick me because I dumped his daughter last month. Well, guess what? The head coach made a recommendation to the high performance committee about who should be on the team. If the high performance committee studied the decision-making process of the coach, the recommendations and the reasons for excluding you from the team, it's less likely that the entire high performance committee was biased against you. So the board of directors is also a good place to go to. If you have a process that would normally be a single person deciding, then it's better to have someone sort of rubber stamp. I don't want to say rubber stamp, but they look into the decision and look at the process, and they make sure that there was no possible conflict of interest in making that decision. So the decisions that can be made by a group of individuals rather than just one. So we will have, for example, if you have a team of coaches, you have the head coach and assistant coaches. You can involve the assistant coaches in the decision. So again, less likely that one person will have so much influence in the decision that they'll get their way in and unduly influence the decision one way or another. So it's just a reduced perception also from the part of the people who are negatively affected by a decision to know that several individuals were involved in the decision. It's comforting in the sense that that there's not one single individual who may not necessarily be your best friend or like you that would have made that decision and completely influenced the process for reasons that had nothing to do with the decision in the first place. So if you're making a decision about selecting an athlete on the team, it should be about that athlete's capacity to perform. If you are making a decision, but if that athlete is a really good performer, but that athlete is very disruptive because of discipline issues, then even though that athlete is very performing, the behavior issues are hindering the chances of your team winning, then it's a good reason for removing that athlete, even though he might be the best and has the best skills on the team. So it's always a matter of making sure that the reasons why you're making your decisions are linked to the goal of the decision-making process and not influenced by outside factors that should not weigh in. Okay, the next one is to play it by the book. So if you make decisions that are compliant with the policies and the rules, then it's less likely that you're going to be pointed as being biased or being in conflict of interest. And I say this because, as I mentioned before, in a very small sport organization, it's really hard to have completely independent people. But if you render decisions that can be justified by the facts, that are supported by the rules and compliant with the rules, and decisions that would end up being the same no matter who decided, then no one can accuse you of being in conflict of interest, because even if you were to remove yourself and let someone else decide, they would look at the facts, they would look at the rules, and they would say, I will render the exact same decision. So I'll give you an example of that. We have an athlete who's missed curfew in the first week of the training camp, and you have it in your code of conduct. It's very clear that the first time that there's a curfew missed, that the person will receive a written reprimand. And the second time that there's a curfew missed, that person will be expelled from the training camp. So the policy is very strict on that and is very clear on that. So no matter who decides, if the athlete is in fact breaching the curfew for the second time during the training camp, then being expelled from the camp is exactly what needs to be done. If you make an exception to the rule and you happen to have maybe, that kid is your neighbor or that kid is your business associate's daughter, Now people are going to say, well, why are you not following the rules? And you're actually not following the rules in favor of someone that you know or someone you care about. So if your decisions are compliant with the rules and policies and they're well justified by the facts, then you have nothing to worry about in terms of being accused of a conflict of interest. And even if someone was to accuse you wrongfully of being in conflict of interest, even if your decision was going to be appealed or sent to an arbitrator, the arbitrator would likely recognize that even though you were in conflict of interest, or you may have been in conflict of interest, or you may not have been completely independent in the matter, in the view of the facts, and applying those rules to the facts, the arbitrator will come to the same conclusion as you. All right, so I would be ready to talk about the two cases. We're just over an hour now, so I think we're making good time. And maybe I see there's been a question typed since I last paid attention to what if none exists? Can you make a request for a creation of an independent body for one selection process? I'm trying to figure out that you'd have like a, would that be like the entire committee is in conflict of interest? I'm not sure I understand the question. And maybe you responded to something I said, and it was a while ago, so I'm not sure to what exactly what I said that prompted to ask that question.
Maybe, Kim, at the end, if you have the same question still or any other questions related to that topic, you can bring it up again on the call at the question and answer at the end.
Okay, then maybe what I can say something that might be helpful in that situation is if you have a criteria to render your decision, whether it's a disciplinary policy, a code of conduct, or it's a team selection policy, or it's a bid process to award a contract. If your criteria is objective, so it's a ranking, it's points, it's and you have factors that are not subjective. You're not making a judgment on it. You're just looking at the numbers and you're adding them and you're multiplying them. Whatever the process is supposed to be is really clear and objective. Then it's easier to have, even if you have some people on the committee that are not truly independent, because the criteria is objective, it's going to be really hard for them to tweak the data so much that they influence the outcome. So we do talk about using objective criteria versus subjective criteria in our team selection workshop. And we talk about the importance of, if you are using subjective criteria, then the objectivity of the process and the objectivity of the decision makers is even more important. But if you're using objective and their numbers, and those numbers are assigned by competition results, or those would be the most likely in sport, competition results, ranking systems, then it's less likely that you'll be accused of conflict of interest because you've only applied objective facts to a set of criteria. So hopefully that helps a little bit, but maybe we can address those questions later if they remain. So I'm going to talk to you about a case that occurred in 2013, so it's not that long ago, but it has some interest for discussing conflict of interest. So we have an athlete, Rémi Beaulieu, who's on the speed skating team. He's been on a speed skating. There we go. I'm struggling with my English now. So he's been on a national team for 4 years. And he filed an appeal before the STRCC after not being selected to the national team on the 5th year. But he finished 9th, and they were selecting 8 athletes on the team. So he filed for an internal appeal at Speed Skating Canada. And his request was denied, but he never had an internal appeal take place. They denied his right to an internal appeal. So the selection policy, as I mentioned, said that they selected athletes who placed in the top 8, but they also allowed a discretion to consider athletes who were injured during the trial. So they had criteria that allowed athletes who had been consistently placing in the top 8 but were unfortunately injured at the time of the trial. So they were going to consider adding them to the team. So the athlete's position is that the internal appeal was wrongfully denied. He should have been allowed to have an internal appeal. He said that he outperformed athletes who were allowed on a team with injury buys. So what he's saying is they took athletes that had injuries, but they were ranked lower than me even before they got injured. And the discretion left to select those injured athletes were excessive and flawed. And he also pointed out that there's a conflict of interest on the selection committee because, well, for those familiar with speed skating, you may know Charles Hamelin, who's been for a long time best speed skater short track in Canada. Yves Hamelin is his father, and he was the high performance director, sitting on the selection committee for a number of decisions relating to the team. While Charles had a brother, Francois, who was on the team as well, and while no one ever questioned when Charles Hamelin was on the team because his performances were so obviously in the top 8, that when Charles was selected on the team, nobody argued whether or not he was. But in this particular case, Francois, the brother of Charles and the son of Yves, ended up being selected as one of those athletes with an injury, who was injured during the trial. So that created this apprehension of bias on the part of the claimant. So Speed Skating Canada at the time supported their initial decision not to select Beaulieu to the team, and they refused his right to an internal appeal. They stated that they applied the bias properly. One of the things that happened with the internal appeal, and I'm not sure if it's, so the arbitrator had verified why the right to an internal appeal was denied. And what had happened, and this is a lesson learned as well for some of you, and maybe not in BC so much, but in other provinces where it's important to have policies in 2 official languages in Canada. We have an athlete who had the English version of the policy said something different, and it's only a matter of one word being different. The policy said you have, in English, the policy said you have 10 days irrespective of, wait a second, I have to think about this. It's 7 days irrespective of weekends or holidays. So it was exactly 7 days, no matter what. So you receive the decision on Friday, and because it's 7 days irrespective of weekends, then the next Friday, if you haven't filed your appeal, then it's you're out of time. Rémi Beaulieu, being French, read the French version of the policy, and the policy said that you have 7 days from the time of learning of the decision, excluding weekends and holidays. So instead, in French, of saying the equivalent of irrespective, they use the term excluding, the equivalent of excluding. So that meant for Rémi Beaulieu that he had 7 working days, which led him to apply on the Monday, let's say, and I'm pretending here, but he received the decision on Friday, and he filed his appeal on the Monday, but the following week. So essentially 10 days later, but within the 7 days, according to the French version of the policy. The case manager was English speaking, and the case manager ran the English version of the policy, and it said, you're out of time, and on top of that, you don't have any admissible grounds for your policy, so we're not going to hear it. He came to the SDRCC, and the arbitrator determined that there was a conflict of interest on the high performance committee by virtue of Yves Amelin having taken part in the meeting. Yves Amelin was, and I'll backtrack a little bit, Yves Amelin was the high performance director. He was sitting on the high performance committee, but he was not voting. He didn't have any voting rights, but he participated in the discussion. We'll talk about that as a circumstance of the case. So this is what the arbitrator had to say about Yves Amelin taking part in the meeting. Even though he did not have a vote, his presence could potentially have inhibited or otherwise affected the discussion that occurred. While there is no evidence that anything of the sort actually occurred, the presence of Yves Amelin had the potential to taint the committee's decision-making. So if you're sitting as a high-performance committee member and the high-performance director is in a room and you'd like to say something not necessarily complimentary about his son, are you going to have the guts to say it out loud in his presence? Because if you do have something and you do have concern about his son and his capacity to be on the team, you have to be able to say it freely and not fear retaliation or consequences for saying something negative about his son. So just the fact that he was sitting in the room when the discussion takes place, the arbitrator said is not appropriate. So one of the things that happened with speed skating at the time was that it occurred on a number of occasions that François was on the borderline of making the team, and people claimed that Yves Amelin, being the high performance director, unduly influenced the decision in his favor. The first case, Yves Amelin was in the room and discussed, and the second time he stayed in a room, but he did not intervene in the discussion, but just the fact that he was there. And then the third time around, he was actually removed from the meeting while that discussion was taking place. So there was a learning curve there. It took 3 cases at the SDRCC before they understood what the proper process was. It was a bit unfortunate. It caused a lot of stress for the athletes and the affected athletes as well, the athletes who were being challenged with their position on the team. So it wasn't fun for them at the time. I believe, and I've heard, and I can't say for sure, but I believe that Yves Amelin, I know that he was an expert in the sport, and he had all the knowledge he needed to be a high-performance director, so I don't think he was there necessarily to to make sure that his kids were going to make the team. He was an expert in speed skating, but the fact that that his sons were performers and very high performance on the national team at the same time as he was high-performance director created that situation where he was constantly in conflict of interest when making decisions, especially when François was wavering on and off the team based on his performance. So that's one particular case that I think that's very telling of how important it is. The arbitrator in this, and I guess I shouldn't have changed my slide, but the arbitrator in this particular case agreed with the high performance committee that Beaulieu had not made the team because he finished 9th in points, and that the criteria clearly said that they were only going to take 8 athletes on the team. But he wasn't necessarily impressed with the fact that they denied his right to an internal appeal when he should have, based on their error in not translating the policy properly. He was entitled to that internal appeal. He also agreed with the athlete that that there was admissible grounds for his appeal, so he was justified to appeal based on the fact that there was a conflict of interest in the decision-making process. So what the arbitrator decided on that particular case, and he investigated, of course, by asking the federation what would be the impact on having 9 athletes on the national team that year instead of 8. And the arbitrator was not comfortable removing François Hamelin or the other affected party, the other athletes. 2 athletes had been given a bye to make that team. And the arbitrator didn't want necessarily to remove those athletes who were given a bye, but he ordered the federation to repair their error. He ordered the federation to accept Rémi Beaulieu on the team as a 9th athlete for that national team that year. Right. So the other case I want to talk about is Laberge and Bobsleigh Canada. And what happened in that particular case is that they had trials, and they were selecting a team for the World Cup tour, and they were going to select athletes that ranked 1st, 2nd, and 3rd in the trials to be on the World Cup tour team. And then those who finished 4th, 5th, and 6th would be on the Intercontinental Cup tour. So it's a team that goes to events around the world, but the events are slightly lower quality than the World Cup tour. So they had their criteria set out, and it was fairly straightforward. When the decision was rendered to select Laberge on the national team, there was an athlete who had finished 5th in the trials, and she was excluded from the Intercontinental Cup tour in favor of Laberge, who had finished 7th. So she appealed that decision of Bobsleigh Canada, and they had an internal appeal process. And the internal appeal panel found in favor of Prediger, who had finished 5th, but the rationale of the internal appeal panel was they deselected Laberge from the team, and they added Prediger to the team on the basis that the head coach of the team had, in formulating its recommendation to the team selection committee, consulted all the coaches of the athletes except for Prediger's coaches. So Lynette Prediger was saying, the head coach did not recommend me on the team, even though I finished 5th, and the criteria is clear about me making the team. And he did so because he didn't involve my coach in his consultation process. So the internal appeal panel put Prediger on the team and removed Laberge from the team on that basis. Laberge had not been invited to the process, so now she was being removed from the team without having had an opportunity to defend herself. So she appealed to the SDRCC because she wanted that internal appeal decision to be overturned on the basis of the fact that she was not invited and it was an unfair process because she was not invited to participate in the process. So the arbitrator had 2 things to determine. First, the absence of Laberge during the internal appeal, was it sufficient to invalidate their decision? And if so, because there was a time sensitivity to the case, you had to decide at the same time, if I invalidate the internal appeal decision, was the original selection decision the right one? So I'm just going to go through my slides here because I think I might have gone ahead of myself. So as I mentioned, the selection committee, upon recommendation of the head coach, selected Jackson LaBerge. The other athlete appealed that decision. Jackson LaBerge was not invited, and the appeal panel decided in favor of Lynette on the basis that her coach was excluded from the consultation. So the claimant's position, that's LaBerge, there is no basis for the appeal decision to reinstate Lynette Prediger. So the appeal panel should not have meddled with that initial decision. LaBerge should have been given the opportunity to participate in the appeal proceeding, and there's no rationale provided for the appeal panel's decision. Her results had improved significantly in the last year and warranted the head coach's recommendation and the selection committee's support. So the respondent's position is Bob Canada. They said they supported their initial decision to select LaBerge. This is an interesting twist to some of the cases at the SDRCC, because normally when a decision is challenged before the SDRCC, the athlete is challenging a decision of the National Federation, and the Federation is usually not necessarily in agreement with the person claiming at the SDRC. In this particular case, Boxing Canada was saying, we selected LaBerge in the first place. We don't agree with the internal appeal decision to remove her from the team. And they argued that it was justified based on the discretion that the head coach had to replace athletes if he thought that they were better than those who happened to finish ahead in the trials. Lynette Prediger, who was excluded from the original selection, said that the selection committee violated its own rule by selecting the 7th-ranked athlete. And she was eligible for selection, and the head coach had acknowledged that there may have been bias in the process because he did not consult with her personal coach. So the arbitrator's analysis in that particular case was, and I'll read it, and you can read it with me, even considering the broader and ordinary usage of the term bias, namely whether a fair-minded and informed observer, having considered the fact, would conclude that there was a real possibility that the decision maker was biased. So the context is nevertheless important, that the arbitrator is saying this, and then he's quoting a book from the published in 2010 on modern sport law. And the author says, bias is context-specific, and the fact that the proceedings at issue are tribunal and not judicial proceedings should be taken into account. It follows that the issue of bias, actual or apparent, should be approached with a measure of realism and good sense, reflecting that in sport the relevant community is often a small one, with the personalities involved having to interact frequently with and being well known to each other. So he's putting this in the context, and the arbitrator, when he analyzed this, decided that even though there might have been bias on the part of the head coach, the fact that the head coach was not the final decision maker, rather it was the selection committee that approved the recommendation of the coach, he found that, and he also had heard from a selection committee member, that there was a genuine discussion on the merits of the selections recommended by the head coach. He was satisfied that the appeal panel's finding of bias was incorrect. So he reversed, well, he didn't reverse the decision, that's the thing. So he said the internal appeal panel was wrong in assessing that there was bias in the selection made. But then the arbitrator had to go back and decide whether or not the policy was properly applied. And what he found was that even though there was not enough to conclude that there was bias or conflict of interest in the decision, the policy had not been officially followed. So he agreed that Prediger should have been selected to the team, but he disagreed that the decision was biased. So it was all put into context. What happened in that particular case was very unfortunate for everyone, I suppose, because the internal appeal process did not allow LaBerge to be invited to the appeal and the hearing and provide her with an opportunity to defend her position on the team. And because of that big error in procedure and in the rules of natural justice, the arbitrator awarded costs against the National Sport Organization. So LaBerge was represented by a lawyer, and the arbitrator made Bobsleigh Canada pay the lawyer fees because it was their breach of natural justice in the internal appeal that caused the need for the athlete to come to the SBRCC to have her day in court. So those are the two cases I wanted to talk about. So in one case, we have a situation where there was a conflict of interest, and because there was a conflict of interest, the arbitrator decided to alter the decision of that decision maker. And in the second one, he said that there might have been a bias in the process, but that was not sufficient to justify that it was the sole reason why the decision was made in that particular way. So he ended up changing the decision, but not because it was biased, just because it wasn't following policy. So the second one acknowledged that sometimes you don't have a choice, but to be in situations where you're not completely independent. But that's the reality of a sport system, and that's the reality especially of very small sport organizations. So I think we have time. We have time to entertain questions. I'll be happy to answer. I don't know if you want to do that by raising hand and ask the question verbally, or you want to continue typing. I see someone is typing a question already. Robin, I'll let you handle that question process, and I'll be happy to answer when I'm asked.
Yeah, absolutely. You can type a question into the chat box, or feel free to unmute your line and just answer a question or ask your question over the phone. It looks like Jason is typing, so it looks like he has a question.
Or if it's a long question, maybe it's easier to just unmute. Yes, a volunteer is having a conflict with their sport organization. Wait, I'm not sure. You're asking whether we can provide dispute resolution services to someone in conflict with their sport organizations? Is that what your question is? Okay. We offer our services at the national team level at the moment. Our funding coming from Sport Canada. Our jurisdiction is over sport organizations that receive funding from Sport Canada. So they are all national organizations and multi-sport national organizations. We do have a fee-for-service program. It certainly is a lot cheaper than going to civil courts, but it's not free. Our arbitrators and mediators, and that's public knowledge, I'm not breaching any confidentiality here, they're paid $250 an hour. So someone has to pay them if they're going to do a case that's not arising from a national team matter. And Robin, I don't know if you're familiar with the viaSport programs in terms of dispute resolution, and if you have, I believe that at some point there were some mediators available to help with some of the issues, and I don't know if you're the best person to speak to at that point, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it probably wouldn't be myself, but we do have Heather Beatty, who's our acting director of sport development, who does manage any issues and disputes that come in as well. So yeah, we are available.
Yeah. And I may say, while you're typing, Jason, that we are working We're working really hard right now. We're developing a program. We actually hired a new staff member at the FDRCC to run this program for us. We're looking to work with law schools and to recruit law students who have an interest in sport, to become resources to help out with disputes that arise in the sport organizations and their communities, and at the community level or at the provincial level. So I don't know when that's going to be in place, but there's a plan to come in and then help at the local level, but not now. So if it's a case that you have now, yeah, Heather Beatty, maybe you have the contact information that you can share. Robin, I don't have it in front of me, but I'm in touch a lot with Heather on those cases.
Yep, absolutely. Let me just send you her email here, Jason. Is there any other questions for Marie-Claude? Andrew Lynn, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Regarding I think it's the flexible red list, it seems to me in that situation that parties that might be affected by any decisions are sort of now being called out to almost be the bad guy in that situation. Is there a way where that can happen and the individuals sort of don't? I don't know. I'm not sure how to ask the question, but it seems like it puts them in an awkward situation to say yes or no, whether they feel comfortable about individual, being on a committee or something like that where a decision is made.
That's fine. I'll just explain to you what the process we use to make sure that our arbitrators are independent from the issues that they arbitrate, and that might shed some light on that. But I agree with you; it might be uncomfortable for someone. It shouldn't really be the decision maker asking them, "Are you okay with me continuing?" But there has to be a process, and again, when I talked about having a conflict of interest policy, then you can work things into a process of designating individuals to sit on committees or to render decisions. So in an arbitration process, which I think is comparable to being in a decision-making process, as soon as the arbitrator is appointed, and sometimes they'll be chosen by the parties from our list or they'll be appointed by rotation. We send that arbitrator a list of the parties involved, the representatives of these parties, and so everybody that we know is involved or affected by the case at hand is listed on that document. It's called the Declaration of Independence. So the arbitrator will review. And for some of those who have been very active with law firms and have been representing clients when they were lawyers, because a lot of them are lawyers, they will do even a conflict check to make sure that their firm is not doing legal work for the firm of the legal representative representing one of the parties. So they will do a conflict check that's very thorough. And if they find that there is something that the parties should know, they will have a place to declare it. So they either declare that they're completely independent and they accept the case, or that they are willing to accept the case as long as the parties agree to their appointment, but they want to declare these facts. So I'll give you a situation that's a bit funny at the same time, but it shows how everybody has a different sensitivity to conflict of interest. And even among our arbitrators, we have some different levels of sensitivity. And we once had an arbitrator who, upon reviewing the names of the parties and the legal representatives of the parties, she decided that she was going to make a declaration about facts that she thought was important for people to know. And what she declared was that about 30 years ago when she was in law school, she had an affair with the lawyer representing one of the athletes. and she made that declaration in writing. And what happens is if someone makes a declaration of facts, then we take a copy of the document and we circulate it to the parties. And she knew about this. So we circulate to the parties, and then we say, if anyone has any concerns with that declaration, you contact us. So they don't contact the arbitrator, they contact us, the case manager. So if anyone on the case has a concern about that declaration made by the arbitrator, then we wouldn't name, we wouldn't say so-and-so does not want you to be the arbitrator, but we would say someone expressed concerns about that, and then she would withdraw. What turned out to be, not only no one objected to that, but the lawyer admitted to me on the phone that he didn't remember. So must have been one of those drunken nights in law school. But that's to show how everybody has a different level of sensitivity. This person obviously was very, very sensitive to anything that could be brought up that would cause one of the parties to feel that she was biased in favor of one of them even before hearing them. I think someone was typing. Okay, great. So one of the things that you might want to do is just make sure that you have a process that allows people to make those declarations, and then you notify, but it's a third party really that receives any of the concerns that others may have, and then you convey that in an anonymized fashion, the fact that some of the people are not comfortable with that person continuing on. Anything
Is there
else?
any other questions? Don't see any other questions. If you do have any more questions, I'm sure Marie-Claude will be happy to answer them via phone or email. I will send out the recap email. As I said, it probably has about 5 or 6 items now. We keep adding to it, but I'll have all that information sent out tomorrow. For your NCCP number, Kelly, if you didn't include your NCCP number in your registration form, you can I can look you up and find your name. I just need your first and last name, so you should be good. And I will enter this webinar into the locker as well, so you'll have 2 PV points on your transcript if you are a certified coach. So again, I want to say thank you to Marie-Claude. It's super late for you, 3 hours ahead. So thank you so much for taking the time to have the webinar tonight and to answer everyone's questions.
Thank you, Robin, for organizing this.
No problem.
And thank you everyone for showing up. And by the way, I'm not a lawyer, so if you call me, don't ask me for legal advice. I won't be able to give you any, but I'll be happy to point you in the right direction if necessary.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone.